The prairie stretched endlessly, its wide golden grasses shimmering beneath the late summer sun. Mary Whitlock stood in front of her cabin, her gaze traveling across the horizon until it blurred into the blue haze of distant mountains. This land had once felt like promise when she and her husband Thomas had arrived 2 years before, carrying dreams of fertile soil, a warm hearth, and a family. But now, with Thomas buried on the hillside, the cabin seemed less like a home and more like a prison of silence. Mary was only 25, yet loss had carved lines into her face that made her appear older to some, and her solitude had earned her whispers from others. The settlement was a tight-knit place, a small cluster of cabins and a trading post built on the edge of what they called the Apache lands. Men there respected hard work. Women shared gossip at the well, and everyone feared the constant threat of raids. Mary, however, was an uneasy figure in their midst. Too proud to ask for help, too determined to leave, she existed at the fringe, managing her small plot with grit and little else. Each day followed the same rhythm. She rose with the dawn, milked the cow, gathered eggs, split wood, and tried to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil. Her hands bore the calluses of both farmer and homemaker, and though her body was lean, her spirit held firm. But when the sun sank and the shadows crept across the plains, she often sat by the fire with nothing but the creak of the cabin and the moan of wind through the rafters for company. It was in those hours that she felt the weight of being truly alone. Loneliness on the frontier was different from what she'd known back east. There one might have felt left out or forgotten. Here, loneliness was sharper. It was a gnawing reminder that if she fell sick, if she were injured, no one would know until it was too late. Death was not an abstract thought, but a familiar shadow. She had buried Thomas herself, with the help of a neighbor, and each time she passed the small wooden cross, she felt both love and bitterness. He had left her to survive in a world that did not forgive weakness. The settlement folk meant well, but pity had a sharp edge. Women whispered that she was too proud for her own good. Men glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval, as though her independence unsettled them. No one offered her a place in their homes, though she caught the occasional proposal, mostly from older ranchers who wanted someone to keep their cabins tidy. She declined them all. She would not trade one kind of loneliness for another born of convenience. In truth, Mary was caught between two identities. She was no longer a wife, yet not truly free. She was not fully trusted by the settlement, yet she had no other community to claim her. At night, she sometimes dreamed of returning east, but she had nothing there, no family willing to take her in, no money for the journey. The cabin was all she had, and it bound her as tightly as chains. It was this life, stark and lonely, that shaped her into a woman of contradictions. She was tender at heart, but hardened by necessity, wary of strangers yet secretly longing for companionship, stubbornly independent but vulnerable in ways she never admitted aloud. And it was into this world, her fragile balance of survival and sorrow, that fate would deliver the one thing she could never have prepared for. A wounded enemy on her doorstep, a man who would unravel every certainty she clung to. The night was heavy with storm clouds, their bellies swollen with rain that refused to fall. Mary Whitlock bolted the cabin door, fed another log into the fire, and sat with her mending by the hearth. Outside, the wind hissed through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of dust and lightning. It was the sort of night that made a woman grateful for walls, no matter how thin or drafty. But then came the sound, faint, almost swallowed by the wind at first. A dragging shuffle, a muffled thud. Mary froze, her needle paused mid-stitch. Her first thought was of coyotes prowling near the chickens, but as she strained to listen, the sound came again. Slower, heavier, not an animal, but a man. Her heart thumped hard in her chest. She rose, every muscle taut, and reached for the rifle hanging by the door. Settlers on the frontier were taught to be wary, of raiders, of thieves, even of desperate drifters. With the rifle loaded, she unbarred the door just enough to peer outside. The wind caught her hair as she stepped onto the porch. At first, she saw nothing but the trembling grass and the dark outline of the trees. Then her eyes caught a shape slumped against the corner of the cabin. A man. He was half collapsed, his body smeared with dirt and blood, his chest rising in shallow, ragged breaths. His clothes were torn, and in the moonlight she saw the beaded decorations on what had once been a proud garment. Her stomach clenched. He was Apache. Fear shot through her veins like fire. The settlers spoke of Apache raids in hushed voices. How warriors struck without warning, how they stole livestock, burned cabins, and sometimes worse. Her first instinct was to slam the door and pray he died quickly, out of sight. But then he stirred, a low groan escaping his lips, and she saw the wound across his side, deep, raw, and still bleeding. Mary gripped the rifle tighter. If she left him, the wolves or the fever would finish him before dawn. If she dragged him into the settlement, the men would kill him outright, no questions asked. To them, an Apache was never a man, only an enemy. Her heart warred with her head. Logic demanded she protect herself, but something in his struggle pulled at her compassion. She remembered Thomas, her husband, shot through with fever before he died, his body trembling in her arms. She had prayed for someone, anyone, to help her save him. No one had come, and so she acted against reason. She crouched beside the fallen man, rifle still near, and studied his face. He was younger than she expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself. His jaw was strong, his skin bronzed by sun and weather, but there was no cruelty in his unconscious features, only exhaustion and pain. Grunting with effort, Mary hooked her arms under his shoulders and heaved. He was heavy, dead weight, but sheer determination pushed her forward. Inch by inch, she dragged him across the threshold, the wooden floor groaning beneath the weight. By the time she got him onto the rug near the hearth, her arms were shaking and sweat dripped into her eyes. She stood over him, chest heaving, rifle still in her grip. For a moment, she wondered if she had lost her senses entirely. But then he coughed, his eyelids fluttering open, and she found herself staring into eyes as dark and sharp as obsidian. Neither spoke. His gaze was wary, suspicious, yet desperate. Her hand trembled on the rifle, but she could not bring herself to raise it. Instead, she said the only thing her conscience allowed, "Don't move. I'll see what I can do." And with that, Mary Whitlock, the lonely settler widow, crossed a line she could never uncross. She had given shelter not to a stranger, but to an enemy. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood. Mary worked quickly, though her hands shook as she fetched a basin of water from the barrel outside and tore strips from an old sheet to use as bandages. The wounded Apache, she would later learn his name was Taza, lay half-conscious on the rug, his breaths shallow and uneven. Each time she touched him, he stirred, his eyes flicking open just long enough to glare at her, before exhaustion pulled him under again. She had tended wounds before. Thomas had once cut his hand to the bone with an axe, and she had stitched him up. But this was different. This was no loved one. This was an enemy. Every stroke of the wet cloth over his skin felt like a betrayal to her people, and yet her conscience whispered that leaving him to die would stain her soul. The gash across his side was angry and deep, likely from a bullet grazing or tearing through. She cleaned it with trembling care, biting her lip at his low groans. At one point, he snapped awake and tried to push her away, muttering something in a tongue she didn't understand. His strength startled her. He could have easily grabbed the rifle propped near the wall if he weren't so weak. But then his hand fell limply back, his chest heaving, and Mary resumed her work. By the time she finished binding the wound, she was exhausted. She sat back on her heels, staring at him, her mind whirling. She had crossed a dangerous threshold. If anyone from the settlement found him here, she would be branded a traitor, accused of aiding the very people who raided their cattle and burned their barns. The settlers were harsh in judgment, and she had few friends to defend her. That night, sleep evaded her. She sat in the rocker by the fire, rifle across her lap, watching the stranger breathe. Shadows flickered over his features. The high cheekbones, the long black hair tangled with blood and dirt, the strong jaw clenched even in unconsciousness. She wondered who he was beyond the word Apache. Did he have a family? Was someone waiting for him as she had once waited for Thomas? The thought unsettled her. The next morning, Mary rose early and carried on with her chores as if nothing had changed. She fed the cow, gathered eggs, split wood. But every sound of the axe seemed louder, every step back to the cabin heavier. She felt the weight of the secret pressing down on her chest. When she ventured to the well later that week, she kept her face carefully neutral. But one of the rancher's wives tilted her head and said, "You're looking pale, Mary. Everything all right out there?" "Fine," Mary lied smoothly, but her pulse quickened. Already she imagined suspicion in their eyes. Back at the cabin, she set food near the stranger. At first he refused, turning his head away, pride stiff in his shoulders despite his weakness. But by the third day, hunger won, and he ate quietly, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. Slowly, words passed between them, halting, broken phrases in English. Enough for him to tell her his name, Taza. Enough for her to warn him sternly, "No one must know you're here." The secret drew them into an uneasy alliance. She provided food and shelter. He accepted, though begrudgingly. But the danger of discovery hung like a blade over them both. Each time a horse's hooves sounded faintly on the prairie road, Mary's stomach dropped. Each time she saw smoke from a neighbor's chimney, she imagined whispers spreading about her. And yet she did not waver. Day by day, she tended to Taza's wound, keeping him hidden in the loft when anyone approached. Each act of concealment deepened the risk, but also deepened the strange bond between them. He was no longer just the Apache to her. He was a man with a face, a name, and eyes that seemed to see past her defenses. Still, as she tucked the blanket around him one evening, Mary knew a truth she could not ignore. Secrets never stayed buried long on the frontier. It was only a matter of time before someone came knocking at her door, and when that day came, everything she had worked to preserve would shatter. The settlement was never truly quiet. Though small, with only a scattering of cabins, a blacksmith, and a trading post, it buzzed with the constant murmur of lives pressed close together. News traveled faster than the wind, and suspicion even faster. Mary knew this all too well, which was why every trip into town to fetch supplies felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she had found Taza. He was healing slowly, his strength returning bit by bit, but she still kept him hidden in the loft whenever she left. Before heading to the settlement, she gave him strict instructions. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." His dark eyes always followed her warily, but he obeyed. Trust was fragile between them, but necessity kept them bound. At the trading post, Mary's nerves prickled. She picked out flour, coffee, and soap, careful not to buy too much at once. Too much would raise questions. As she laid her coins on the counter, old Mrs. Callahan squinted at her. "You're keeping busy out there, Mary," the woman said, her tone sharpened with curiosity. A lone woman managing a cabin all by herself. Must be hard. Mary forced a small smile. "Hard work keeps me from going soft." The men nearby chuckled, but there was no kindness in it. A rancher named Ellis leaned against the wall, chewing a piece of straw, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Saw movement near your place last week. You get a visitor?" Her breath caught, but she forced herself to act calm, hefting the sack of flour onto her hip. "Just the wind playing tricks on you. My land creaks and moans like an old man when the weather turns." Ellis didn't look convinced. He spat into the dirt and muttered, "Strange, that's all. Strange for a widow to keep to herself so much." Mary's skin prickled as she left the post, her supplies heavier than they should have been. She could feel their eyes on her back, burning with suspicion and curiosity. The whispers followed her in subtle ways. When she stopped at the well, 2 women hushed their conversation, but their eyes darted toward her. At church the following Sunday, she caught a rancher's boy whispering to his friend, the 2 of them glancing her way and snickering. It was nothing outright, nothing she could confront, but she could sense it. The settlement turning its gaze toward her, searching for cracks in her composure. Back at the cabin, she unburdened herself in motion rather than words. She kneaded bread with fierce determination, her thoughts a tangle of fear and anger. Taza, watching her from his spot in the loft, finally spoke. "They doubt you?" Mary glanced up at him, startled that he had pieced that much together from his limited English. "They're suspicious," she admitted quietly. "One wrong move, and they'll know." His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Then why risk?" The question struck her deeper than she expected. Why indeed? Why had she risked her reputation, her safety, her place in the settlement for him? She opened her mouth but found no easy answer. At last she muttered, "Because it was the right thing to do." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. But the way his gaze lingered told her he did not take her words lightly. In the days that followed, the whispers only grew. A rancher claimed he saw smoke at her place at odd hours. Someone else swore they heard voices, though she lived alone. Every trip to town was a careful performance, every word measured, every gesture restrained. Mary could feel the noose tightening. Secrets were fragile things on the frontier, and hers was growing heavier by the day. Each time she returned home, she looked at Taza and knew it was only a matter of time before the world outside her cabin door crashed in, exposing everything she had tried so desperately to keep hidden, and when it did, there would be no mercy. The days stretched into weeks, each one marked by the fragile rhythm Mary and Taza created within the cabin. He healed slowly, the angry wound at his side closing into a scar, his strength returning enough for him to sit upright for longer stretches and eventually to help with small tasks. At first, their exchanges were nothing more than necessities, gestures, short phrases, awkward silence, but the longer he remained, the more they began to see each other as people rather than enemies. Mary was the first to notice small changes. One morning she came in from gathering eggs to find that Taza had repaired the broken latch on the door using a scrap of leather and a steady hand. Another evening, when she was splitting wood and the axe slipped dangerously close to her boot, he appeared in the doorway, his face set with concern. Though he said nothing, the way his eyes lingered made her feel less invisible than she had in months. It unsettled her. He was still an Apache raider, the very kind of man settlers feared. Yet when she looked at him now, she no longer saw only the warnings whispered at the settlement. She saw the curve of his brow when he concentrated, the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself even when weak, the careful restraint in his movements, as though determined never to frighten her. Their conversations grew in fragments. Taza's English was limited, but he listened closely, picking up words she repeated often. She learned to simplify her speech, to gesture when needed. One evening by the fire, she asked about the beaded strap he wore around his wrist. He paused, eyes distant, then touched it gently and said one word. "Mother." It was the first personal thing he had shared, and the weight of it made Mary's throat tighten. In return, she found herself telling him pieces of her own story, how Thomas had died of fever, how the silence of the cabin pressed in on her each night. She expected ridicule or indifference, but instead Taza listened, truly listened. His gaze was steady, his silence not dismissive, but respectful. In his presence, she felt seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. Still, trust came in fits and starts. One afternoon, Mary returned from the well to find Taza standing near her rifle. Her heart lurched into her throat. But when their eyes met, he lifted his hands slowly, deliberately, showing he had not touched it. Then he stepped away without a word. The gesture told her more than any speech could have. He was showing her that, despite everything, he would not harm her. Gradually, their routines entwined. He began helping with chores when his body allowed, chopping small logs, carrying water, mending tools. The work eased her burden, but it also made the cabin feel less like a place of shadows and more like a home. In the evenings, they shared quiet meals, the firelight softening the tension between them. Sometimes Mary caught herself studying his face too long, noticing the strength in his jaw, the steadiness in his hands, and she quickly looked away, confused by her own thoughts. Yet even as this fragile bond grew, the outside world pressed in. Mary could not forget the whispers in the settlement, the suspicious glances, nor could she forget the risk of discovery. Every time a rider passed on the road, she tensed. Every knock at the door made her heart pound. The danger was real, but so too was the strange comfort she found in Taza's presence. One night, As thunder rolled across the plains, Mary sat by the fire while Taza worked quietly at carving a piece of wood. The silence between them was not heavy, but companionable. She realized with a start that she no longer felt alone, and that frightened her more than anything, because the more she came to rely on his presence, the more devastating it would be when the world outside discovered him and tore them both apart. The first hints of trouble came on a cold morning in early autumn. Mary was out hanging laundry when she saw dust rising on the prairie road, several riders approaching, their figures cutting sharp against the horizon. Her stomach twisted. Visitors were rare out here, and unannounced visitors almost never brought good news. She rushed inside, heart pounding, and found Taza sitting at the table, carefully whittling a piece of wood. His eyes flicked to hers, immediately catching the alarm in her face. "Riders!" she said breathlessly, pointing toward the road. His body went rigid. Without a word, he climbed into the loft, moving with a quiet swiftness that belied his still-healing wound. She pulled a blanket over the ladder and prayed it would be enough. Moments later came the heavy knock. Mary smoothed her apron, willed her heartbeat to slow, and opened the door. Ellis, the rancher who had been watching her so closely in town, stood at the front, flanked by 3 other men from the settlement. Their faces were grim, their eyes scanning past her into the cabin. "Morning, Widow Whitlock," Ellis said, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "We've had word of Apache scouts in the area. Thought it wise to check cabins on the outskirts. Don't suppose you've seen anything unusual?" Her mouth went dry. She shook her head, gripping the door frame to keep from trembling. "Nothing but the usual wind and coyotes." Ellis's lips curled faintly. "Mind if we take a look?" Mary's pulse thundered. She wanted to slam the door, to tell them no, but refusal would only confirm their suspicions. With a tight nod, she stepped aside. The men spread through the cabin like hounds, opening cupboards, peering behind the woodpile, stomping across her floorboards as though the home were theirs. One even kicked at the rug with his boot as if expecting something or someone to crawl out. Mary clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. Up in the loft, she knew Taza crouched in tense silence. She dared not look upward for fear her eyes would betray him. Then one of the men, Jacob, a burly fellow with a mean streak, paused by the ladder. He tugged at the blanket covering it, eyes narrowing. "What's this?" Panic surged. "Old quilts," Mary blurted. "For winter." But Jacob was already pulling the blanket away. His eyes traveled upward and then froze. A shadow shifted above. "Taza! Found him!" Jacob bellowed. In an instant, the cabin erupted into chaos. The men surged forward, shouting. Mary cried out as Jacob grabbed the ladder and began to climb. Taza, cornered, descended with the fierce grace of a predator. Though weakened, he moved fast, knocking Jacob back with a single shove that sent the man crashing into a chair. The others raised their rifles. Mary threw herself between them and Taza, her arms outstretched. "Stop! Please, don't shoot!" Ellis's face twisted with fury. "You've been harboring him. An Apache raider under your roof?" Mary's voice shook, but she held firm. "He was wounded. He would have died." "I couldn't what?" Ellis snarled. "Let justice be served? You've betrayed your own kind, woman." The men surged forward, seizing Taza. He struggled, but his strength had not fully returned, and their numbers overwhelmed him. They bound his hands with rope, ignoring Mary's desperate pleas. She fought against them, tears burning in her eyes. "He's not what you think. He's a man, not a monster," but her words fell on deaf ears. To them, she was no longer the quiet widow at the edge of the settlement. She was something far worse, a woman who had given shelter to the enemy. As they dragged Taza outside, Ellis spat at her feet. "There'll be a reckoning for this, Mary Whitlock. You've made your choice, and now you'll answer for it." Mary stood in the doorway of her cabin, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. The secret she had guarded so carefully had shattered, spilling into the open like broken glass. And as she watched Taza hauled away in ropes, the bitter truth sank in. Their fates were now bound together, and the settlement would decide what became of them both. The settlement gathered in the meeting hall that evening, a squat wooden building used for everything from Sunday worship to disputes over land. Tonight it pulsed with tension. Word had spread quickly. Mary Whitlock had been found harboring an Apache raider in her cabin. Families crowded shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by lantern glow, their whispers carrying sharp as knives. Mary stood at the front, her chin high despite the tremor in her hands. Beside her, Taza knelt with his wrists bound, his expression stoic. He did not look at her, but she felt the heat of his presence, the gravity of his silence. The elders sat in a row behind a long table, their eyes heavy with judgment. Ellis wasted no time in rousing the crowd. He stepped forward, voice loud and certain. "Neighbors, you all know the danger we face on this frontier. You all know the raids, the theft, the blood spilled by these savages. And now, one of our own," he jabbed a finger toward Mary, "chose to hide one of them under her roof. Fed him, protected him, lied for him. What does that make her if not a traitor?" A murmur rippled through the hall. Some voices agreed with Ellis, muttering words like disgrace and treachery. Others, softer, questioned aloud whether a woman's compassion should be judged so harshly. But no voice rose in her defense strong enough to silence the storm. Mary forced herself to speak, her voice firm though her throat burned. "I did what any Christian woman ought to have done. He was wounded, dying. Could I stand by and watch him perish like an animal? Would you have me turn away from a soul in need?" Ellis sneered. "Don't dress it up as virtue. You put all of us at risk. What if his kin had followed his trail to your cabin? What if your kindness had cost this settlement our lives?" The hall erupted with shouts, some condemning her, others urging caution. The elders raised their hands for silence. Finally, Elder Mathers, the oldest among them, leaned forward, his voice gravelly but clear. "Enough! The matter is grave." On one hand, the woman acted out of compassion. On the other, she deceived her neighbors and sheltered the enemy. "We must settle this, not with vengeance, but with wisdom." He turned his gaze to Taza, who met it without flinching. "This man is no ordinary prisoner. To kill him outright may bring retaliation from his people. To release him is to invite mistrust among our own. There must be another way." A long silence followed. Then Elder Mathers spoke the words that would alter both their lives forever. "There is an old custom among men. When conflict threatens two sides, sometimes a bond is forged instead of blood spilled. Marriage. If this woman is bound to the Apache by law and covenant, then he is no longer an enemy, but kin. And she will bear the burden of his conduct from here on," the hall gasped. Mary's knees nearly buckled. "Marriage? Forced? Public? Binding?" She searched the faces of the crowd, hoping for outrage, but instead found nods of agreement. Some saw it as punishment, tethering her to the man she had protected. Others saw it as a compromise, a way to avoid bloodshed without seeming weak. Ellis barked a laugh. "So that's it then? We make her his squaw and call it justice?" But Elder Mathers' glare silenced him. "It is decided," he declared. "By dawn, the widow Whitlock and this man will be wed. Let the burden of their choices be carried together." Mary's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the rest of the murmurs. She turned at last to Taza. His face was unreadable, carved of stone, but in his dark eyes she caught a flicker, of anger, perhaps, or humiliation. Whatever it was, it matched the fire in her chest. She had chosen to save him out of mercy. Now the settlement had twisted that mercy into a chain. By the time they were led from the hall, the decision sealed, Mary knew one thing with certainty. Her life was no longer her own. The wedding was no celebration. At dawn, Mary stood in the small church, the air thick with the smell of oil lamps and judgment. She wore her plain work dress, hands clenched in front of her, jaw set like stone. Beside her stood Taza, his wrists freed only for the occasion, his broad shoulders straight, his face unreadable. The minister's words were swift, mechanical, as though he wanted the matter finished quickly. There were no flowers, no music, no blessings spoken with warmth, only the cold murmur of townsfolk watching as Mary Whitlock was bound to the man they had once called enemy. When the vows were spoken, Taza did not bow his head nor soften his voice. He repeated the words firmly, almost defiantly, though she doubted he fully understood them. Mary's own voice trembled as she forced the words out, her cheeks burning. The ring slipped onto her finger like a shackle. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd shifted, some satisfied, others muttering uneasily. But no one protested. The deed was done. They returned to her cabin under the watchful eyes of the settlement. Mary felt each stare like a thorn in her back. Once inside, she slammed the door shut, pressing her hands against it as though she could hold the world out. Taza stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the small space that had been hers alone. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mary whirled on him, fury spilling from her like a storm breaking. "Do you understand what they've done? Do you understand what this means for me? For us?" His dark eyes met hers, calm but hard. "I did not choose this," he said slowly, his English halting but sharp. "Your people chose," her chest heaved. "My people? You think I wanted this? I saved your life, and now I am shackled to you like some punishment." For the first time, his mask cracked. His jaw tightened, his voice low with heat. "You think it is not punishment for me? To be tied like an animal? To stand before your people, bound, humiliated?" The words cut through her anger, replacing it with silence. For a heartbeat, she saw the truth. They were both prisoners of the settlement's will. But the realization did not soothe her rage. It only deepened it. She turned away, gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. The days that followed were thick with tension. They lived in the same cabin, yet every corner seemed divided. Mary worked with her usual ferocity, kneading bread, hauling water, chopping wood, more to exhaust herself than out of need. Taza contributed where he could, mending tools, repairing fences, chopping wood with precise, practiced strokes. But when their paths crossed, their eyes locked with a fire that neither could smother. Meals were eaten in taut silence. Nights were worse. Mary lay on her side of the bed, stiff, the blankets pulled tightly around her. Taza slept on the floor at first, refusing the space beside her. Pride demanding that no one mistake him for a man content with this forced union. Yet, for all the anger between them, necessity forced cooperation. When the cow kicked over the bucket, spilling milk across the floor, Taza wordlessly fetched another pail and held the animal steady. When Mary struggled with the heavy water barrel, he lifted it with ease, ignoring her sharp glare. Each small act was a reminder that they were bound together now, not by choice, but by circumstance. And though they seethed at one another, some deeper current began to flow beneath the anger, a grudging recognition of each other's strength. Still, at night when Mary lay awake, staring at the rafters, she whispered to herself the truth she could not admit aloud. She hated him. She hated the settlement. She hated this marriage forced upon them both. But beneath that hatred was a fear far more dangerous, that someday she might stop hating him at all. The first weeks of their marriage were thick with anger, silence, and suspicion. Mary and Taza shared the same roof, but lived like strangers who resented the very air they breathed in common. The settlement watched them with hawk-like eyes, every encounter at the well, every Sunday service, every trip to town. For Mary, each whisper behind her back was a wound. For Taza, every sidelong glance was an insult he bore with clenched fists. Yet survival has its own way of forcing hands. The land was unforgiving. Droughts came without warning. Wolves prowled the hills, and every day brought fresh toil. One morning, Mary found herself struggling with a stubborn fence post that leaned no matter how many rocks she packed at its base. She cursed under her breath, sweat rolling down her temples. Without a word, Taza appeared, hefted the post upright, and drove it deep into the earth with powerful, steady strikes. He didn't ask for thanks, and she didn't offer it. But when their eyes met, there was something new there. Not warmth, not yet, but acknowledgement. A week later, it was Mary who broke the silence. She had baked bread, and though pride urged her to eat alone, she cut an extra slice and placed it in front of him at supper. "Eat," she muttered. He studied her, wary, before taking it. The meal passed without words, but the tension that had once been razor-sharp dulled ever so slightly. Slowly, necessity knit them together. Taza proved invaluable with the livestock. The cattle seemed to sense his calm authority, and even the most skittish mare settled under his hand. Mary began to trust his skill, grudgingly at first, then with relief, as tasks that had once been overwhelming became bearable with his help. In turn, Taza watched her run the homestead with a grit and determination that impressed him. She was no idle settler woman waiting for rescue. She faced the wilderness with stubborn courage. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled like a beast, slamming against the cabin walls until they shook. Rain hammered the roof and lightning split the sky. When one of the younger calves broke loose from the pen, Mary rushed out into the chaos, skirts whipping in the wind. She slipped in the mud, nearly crushed under the frantic animal, when suddenly strong arms pulled her aside. Taza's voice cut through the thunder. "Foolish woman," he shouted, but his hands were steady as he guided the calf back to safety, drenched and breathless. Mary wanted to argue, to throw his words back at him, but instead she found herself laughing, a sharp, wild laugh born of relief. For the first time, Taza's mouth twitched into something like a smile. In that storm, something shifted. They were no longer enemies under the same roof. They were allies battling the same forces, the wild, the weather, the suspicion of their neighbors. The days that followed carried subtle changes. Their conversations, once clipped, grew longer. Mary began teaching him certain English words he stumbled over, and in turn, he shared with her Apache words, their rhythms strange but beautiful to her ears. When he told her the name of the stars in his tongue, she repeated them softly, tasting their music on her lips. Trust came in increments. When Mary fell ill with fever, Taza stayed at her side through the night, cooling her brow with damp cloths, whispering words she didn't understand, but felt comforted by nonetheless. When he returned one evening with fresh herbs from the hills, she realized he had gone far out of his way, risking discovery, just for her. Mary no longer saw him only as the man forced upon her. She began to see the scars on his body not as marks of violence but as proof of survival. Taza, in turn, no longer looked at her as the enemy's widow, but as a woman fierce and unyielding who fought her battles with quiet strength. They were still far from love. The anger hadn't vanished entirely, and their pride often flared. But the foundation had shifted. Strangers no longer. Enemies no longer. They had become something else. Partners. And beneath that fragile alliance stirred a truth neither dared name, the beginnings of belonging. By the time summer bled into autumn, the cabin no longer felt like a prison. What had begun as a forced union shaped by resentment and fear had, little by little, turned into something Mary scarcely recognized, a life she could endure, even cherish. The whispers in the settlement had not vanished, but they dulled over time as gossip found fresher targets. The townsfolk still eyed Taza with suspicion, yet fewer dared to speak openly against him. Mary noticed that when they saw him repair fences, break horses, or share his hunting spoils with neighbors, their scorn softened into reluctant respect. Inside the cabin, the changes were quieter, more intimate. Mary began to set two bowls at the table without thinking, the rhythm of shared meals natural now. When she woke, she no longer startled to see him by the hearth, sharpening a blade or mending leather. The silence between them was no longer barbed, it had become companionable. Words came easier too. They spoke of practical things at first, crops, animals, weather, then of harder things. Mary told him about Samuel, her late husband, and the crushing loneliness of widowhood. Taza shared fragments of his own grief, his people scattered, his brother slain in battle. Neither spoke with sentimentality. Instead, they traded truths like weary travelers sharing bread. It was in those confessions that the bond between them deepened. Compassion replaced suspicion. Admiration replaced anger. Mary began to see the strength in Taza not as something to fear, but something that steadied her. And Taza began to see Mary's stubbornness not as defiance, but as courage that matched his own. The turning point came with fire. One dry evening, a lantern tipped in the barn, flames leaping hungrily into the hay. Mary rushed forward in panic, but Taza caught her, shielding her from the smoke. He fought the fire with relentless energy, dragging water buckets, shouting orders, refusing to yield even as the barn roof collapsed. Mary joined him, coughing, her skirt singed at the hem. Together they saved the livestock, though the barn itself was lost. When the last flames died, they collapsed in the dirt, exhausted, their faces streaked with soot. Mary looked at him, really looked, and saw not the enemy, not the stranger, but the man who had risked everything to protect what she loved. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. He squeezed it once, rough fingers warm and grounding. That night, for the first time, he did not sleep on the floor. The storm of anger that had defined their union was gone, burned away with the barn. What replaced it was not soft or timid. It was fierce, born of survival, forged in hardship. When he kissed her, it was not the hesitant kiss of strangers, but the desperate claim of two people who had walked through fire and found each other whole on the other side. In the days that followed, their closeness grew. They laughed more, often at the small absurdities of life on the frontier. He teased her about her stubborn way of scolding the chickens. She teased him for the serious frown he wore even when carving wooden spoons. At night they whispered under the same blanket, her head on his chest, his arm around her waist. For the settlement, their marriage was still a curiosity, even a scandal to some. But Mary no longer cared. She had once thought herself punished, shackled to a man she did not choose. Now she realized she had found something rare, a love not given freely, but built stubbornly in the ashes of anger and loss. A love stronger because it had been tested. And as autumn winds swept the valley, Mary looked across the fields to where Taza worked with steady patience. And she felt something she had not felt in years, not fear, not bitterness, but peace. For the first time since Samuel's death, she knew she was not alone.